Welcome to the Faith Community Institute class on help for those living with chronic illness and pain. My name is Svensson, and I'm glad to have you as a part of the 8th in 10 classes on this topic. And today we're going to turn our attention to how to be of practical help. We're going to cover this in the next 2 sessions. I want to remind you that once again, if you would like to submit questions that I'll focus on in our last session, the 10th session, my email address is here. It is also on the handout that you could have or can still download from the website associated with this particular session. This gives you an overview of the topics I hope to cover in the next 2 sessions. And it's really a very practical set of sessions, I hope. First of all, I want to talk about the importance of avoiding judgment of those who are in the midst of despair. And I'll describe what I mean by that. And then I want to spend the rest of the time today on what to say and what not to say. And then, Lord willing, next time we'll talk about how to pray for someone with chronic illness and pain, how to pray for caregivers, a group of people who often tend to be neglected by people who consider the need of those living with chronic illness. Many have caregivers and they have needs too. And then we'll talk about how to be of tangible help, and I'll close out the second session with some helpful resources. But let me start with a particular focus on those of you who are living with chronic illness or pain. I presume there's 2 groups listening, and those who are living with chronic illness or pain, or those who seek to minister to them because you have a spouse, a family member, or friends, or people in your church. But I'd like to address particularly for this beginning time a special message to those who are living with incurable ailments that impairs their health. It is real important for us to realize that living with a constant affliction does not remove us from the obligation to love others, the obligation to try to be of practical help to other people in their affliction. You know, it is easy when you're not feeling well to become very self-absorbed and to not be looking to meet the needs of others because you have so many needs yourself. And yet Jesus reminded us that there are 2 great commandments: love God and love others. And we are not set free from those expectations simply because we're living with affliction. Now, I understand there may be times of intensity of physical ailment and you can hardly do anything. But when you're living with a chronic illness, it is really important that you not forsake the responsibility to love others. And we show that love for others by engaging and serving them, by being of practical help to them. And it's critically important that we do that. Number one, it's good for our spiritual health to not be so focused on ourselves all the time. But secondly, it fulfills our call as followers of Jesus. In addition, I think the Bible tells us that those of us who live with chronic afflictions actually have a special responsibility. And the Apostle Paul speaks of that in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 3 to 4. He says, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our affliction, so that we will be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God." That's a powerful passage. I want you to notice particularly the part that I've marked out in red here. There's a purpose clause in these 2 verses. There's a reason why God brings comfort, why he demonstrates his mercy and aids us in our times of affliction. And that purpose is to prepare us, to equip us to serve others who are in affliction. Notice what Paul says, so that we will be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. The comfort that God gives us in the midst of affliction is a gift, and it's a gift to be shared. we who live with an incurable ailment, with a persistent affliction, have a special responsibility to be on the lookout for ways that we can minister to others who are going through, as Paul said, any affliction. Because we're talking about the same God who will give us comfort, whether the affliction is physical, spiritual, emotional, relational. And we have a special burden, if you will, that we bear. That burden isn't simply a physical burden that we bear because of an illness, but it's a burden of responsibility to especially be on the lookout to try to minister to others. In fact, in the end, that's really why I published the book that I did. Maybe I'll take a moment and tell you that story briefly. When I was stepping down as dean, I let the provost know a year in advance before I wanted to make it public. But I also told my daughter that I had let the provost know that I was going to be stepping down, and gave her kind of the time frame. And she asked me what I was going to do. And I told her, well, my plan is to transition. I don't plan on opening up a laboratory again. And I'm going to transition to writing books. And she asked me, well, what are you going to write about? And I said, well, my plan is, and I've already been working on it, I'm going to write a book on the subject of addiction. It takes me back to where I really began in my career in many ways. And I want to write a book on addiction. And she said, oh, I thought maybe you would write a book about living with chronic illness. You've learned how to live with multiple chronic illnesses. You're a health professional. I thought maybe you would focus your energy on trying to help other people. And that's really where the idea came from. And after I had that conversation with her, I chewed on that for quite a while, and some ideas came to my head. And this passage really challenged me about it. Would that be a way that I could fulfill this passage by combining my professional experience and my experience as a patient to try to help other people who are walking through physical affliction? And even though it was a little bit scary putting my own story out there, I came to believe that I really did have a responsibility to try to share the comfort that I've received, and how God has wed my life together professionally and personally to be able to do that. Some of you who are listening may know that I also published another book. We had a prodigal son who tragically died at the age of 30. And I journaled about that shortly after his death. And those of you who read the book, and you might remember from the preface of that book, I tell the story about that. And one of the senses that I then became burdened with, do I have a responsibility to share this story so that I can share the comfort that I have received through that tragedy with other people? And that's why we decided to go ahead and publish that book and let that story be out there, and to try to help people find biblical help in their time of need. Now, I'm not suggesting that everybody who goes through an affliction should be writing books, but surely there is some purpose that God has taken us through this journey in life. And one of those purposes is that when he comforts us, we are especially equipped to turn around and bring comfort to others who are in a time of affliction. So my challenge for those of you who are listening, who are living with a chronic affliction, is to rise up to the challenge to fulfill this responsibility. Find someone that you can encourage with the hope that you have been given in Christ through your affliction. Maybe you do that one-on-one. Maybe it's by notes. Maybe it's just being alongside them. Maybe it's becoming a special prayer warrior for them. But find some way to share the comfort that God has given to you in your journey with chronic illness, to help someone else in their journey, to help them see God more clearly in their times of darkness. Well, let me move then to talk mostly in the context of how others can interact with people who are living with chronic illness. And I want to say that while it might seem that I'm directing this solely to people who don't live with chronic illness, this is also important for those of us who live with chronic afflictions to keep in mind, because we can make some of the same mistakes. We can be blind to some of the opportunities, So just because we live with a chronic illness doesn't mean we don't need to think about these things as well. And particularly because everybody's journey with chronic illness is a little different. And we can't necessarily expect people to experience it the same way we do. And so I think this is relevant whether you are someone who's coming alongside another who's living with chronic illness, you have a spouse or a other family member who has a chronic illness, or you live with a chronic illness yourself. And one of the first points I want to make is how important it is to avoid judging those who are in the midst of despair. You know, sometimes tragedy strikes a life physically, sometimes spiritually, emotionally. And when that tragedy strikes us, it can unsettle us tremendously. And sometimes people fall into despair. When people live with an intensity of pain, when people live with intense physical battles of fatigue or dizziness and feel like they can hardly do anything, and they see their world crashing down because of the affliction that has come upon them, they can easily be like Job, and they can fall into despair. Many people, when they think of Job, they only think of the first 2 chapters, where Job was so steadfast when he had this rapid staccato of tragedies that entered into his life, and he blessed the Lord in the midst of it. But then when you move into chapter 3 and move forward, you realize that as Job's physical affliction persisted, Job fell into despair. Despair of such a degree that he wondered why he was ever born. He expressed a desire to die. He actually communicated that he felt God had turned against him and had become his enemy. He really fell into the depths of despair. And his friends very quickly turned on him. And they turned on him mostly because they were reacting to his words of despair. And so Job, pretty early on in the dialogue, has some very helpful advice that he gives to them. In Job 6:26, he said, "Do you intend to reprove my words when the words of one in despair belong to the wind?" You know, the wind has no foundation. It's not anchored anywhere. It passes almost as quickly as it comes. And what Job is saying to his friends is, don't take so much stock in the words of pain that I have expressed, because that's what those words are. They're an expression of pain. They weren't the expression of his theology. They were his expression of despair. And we have to realize that sometimes that people who have affliction will fall into despair. And they will say things that are theologically wrong, and they actually might even unsettle us. But we need to be very careful not to judge them based on what they say in moments of despair. The simple reality is doubt is a common element of lament when people are living in times of trouble. Consider a psalm that we looked at in a previous session, Psalm 13, verse 1. David said, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me?" You know, if you look at those words, David's speaking nonsense. Of course God had not forgotten him. Of course God had not hidden himself from David. But that's what it felt like to David. And so David expressed that feeling. He lamented in his pain. And when people give cries of lament in the midst of turmoil, we have to be careful not to judge them spiritually as a result of that. Charles Haddon Spurgeon, a preacher of yesteryear who many of you have probably heard of, you've probably heard of some of his sermons, surely you've heard him referred to. He was a giant of the faith. His preaching is absolutely incredible. But Spurgeon was plagued with deep physical affliction. He had a very intense form of gout that was not treated. not treated well, I should say. There were periods of Spurgeon's life where he was in such intense pain, all he could do was sit in a chair with his both hands and both feet bandaged in agony and hardly do anything. And he fell into periods of deep, dark depression as a result of it. Now, this was a man who was strong in his faith. He knew the truth of God, and yet his expressions in his times of despair might make you think differently about where he stood spiritually. So my warning here is be careful about how you respond to expressions of despair that people who are in the midst of physical affliction. Now, you don't necessarily need to give them a theology lesson and correct their words. And here's a point. We don't need to defend God. When people say something in the midst of despair that is unsettling and we know isn't an accurate picture of God. This is where Job's friends fell into trouble. What happened was they responded to his expressions of despair as though it was their job to defend God and his character. But it wasn't. And if you know the end of Job, you'll remember that Job was not condemned by God when God appeared on the scene for what he had said. He wasn't condemned by God for his complaints, but his friends were condemned, and Job made sacrifices on their behalf to stay the hand of God's judgment against them. Because why? What had they done? They had really turned on Job because they were uncomfortable with what he was saying. They couldn't handle it. They thought they were God's defenders. And we need to realize that's not our role. Our role when somebody is in affliction is to bring comfort and to bring care. Now let me speak some balance into what I just said. I understand there are times when someone persistently speaks errantly. They persistently speak about things that are simply not true about God and his word and his character and his way in the world. And there may be a time that we need to gently bring them along to the truth and point them to the truth of the Bible. And a pastor has a different kind of responsibility than a member of the congregation whose role is to come and be a comforter. You know, a pastor obviously has a more serious responsibility in terms of shepherding them spiritually. And there may be times where someone is persistently going down a wrong road in their thinking, and we need to bring them back. I understand that, and there is a place for that. But when someone's in the midst of despair, what they need is our comfort, they need our encouragement, they need our presence to help anchor their soul. They need us to share truth without spending our time trying to correct everything they say and point to every error that we might hear them utter in the midst of the despair. And importantly, don't judge them as a person and as a Christian because they express their despair. The same would be true in the loss of, let's say, a spouse, where someone immediately after their spouse just cries out in such agony and comes apart. And you might say, whoa, why doesn't this person have a stronger faith that they're handling the death of their spouse better? Don't judge someone based on experiences of despair that come because of tragedies that arrive in their life. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment. Many of us who live in Indiana have seen these devices. They're tall windmills that are used to generate power. And if you've been close up to one, you know they're really tall. We actually have a man in our church who his job is to do maintenance on these. And so he climbs up a ladder on the inside. I didn't even know there was one, but that column is kind of hollow. And so he climbs up on the inside of these things. And what he does is he does maintenance up top. So he crawls all the way up and gets to the top. I asked him one day, I said, you know, when you're up there and it's a windy day, do those things ever, wobble a bit? He says, oh, sure. Yeah, sure they do. You couldn't get me to climb up in one of those. But you know what? These things have a really strong foundation. They're secure. They're intended to be in windy areas. But when they're buffeted by a heavy wind, they'll wobble a bit. What am I trying to make as a point? You and I admire people who don't flinch in the face of suffering, but we shouldn't judge those who wobble when affliction strikes. When high winds buffet, even the strongest of people can wobble. Job did, David did, Elijah did. So be careful not to judge people because they are battered by the storms of life and express their despair at their state in life. What I'd like to turn to now, and what we'll do for the rest of this session, is I'd like to talk about what to say and what not to say to people who are living with chronic affliction. And my reason for spending the time on this is, as I talk with people who live with chronic illness, as I have read memoirs of numerous people with chronic illnesses, I've read their blogs, etc., I can tell you that one of the most difficult experiences for people living with chronic illness is the things that people say. Patients will describe over and over and over the hurt that they have experienced that is the fruit of really thoughtless words that people say. People don't intend to harm them. They don't intend to be hurtful with their words, but not knowing what to say, they often fall into saying the wrong thing. And so I want to spend a little bit of time to start with what not to say, and then what we can say. First of all, do not give unsolicited medical advice. I am withholding the temptation, or holding back the temptation to literally scream that in the microphone as I'm recording this. Don't give unsolicited medical advice. This is such a common complaint of patients. In fact, there are people who don't want their illnesses appearing on our prayer list at church because they know if it does, individuals will come out of the woodwork and tell them what they should do health-wise. People will come out of the woodwork and try to sell them some product they're sure is going to help their advice, help their health. It's such a common source of distress for patients, and I would just urge you, just don't do it. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, your advice is likely to be unsound. Even if you are a health professional, I assume most of you listening to this are not, but even if you are, you don't know very much about the particulars of an individual's case. And it's pretty dangerous to step in and start giving medical advice. And for most of you, I assume you're not trained. You don't really have the knowledge base in which to make health recommendations for other people. And here's a problem with that. The individual probably has learned a fair bit about their ailment. And if you give them unsound health advice, not only could you potentially send them down the wrong road, but here's something even more significant. You damage your credibility to help them in other ways. I mean, if you give them unsound health advice, why should they listen to you if you give them spiritual advice, right? You hurt your credibility. You hurt your ability to come alongside them. In addition, I just want to be frank with you. If you're a person who's prone to give people unsolicited medical advice, people with chronic illness are probably going to want to avoid you. It's a simple fact. There are people who, they develop a reputation of wanting to insert themselves in the health needs of others, and often it's people who sell different products, frankly. And patients will avoid them. They'll avoid them because they just don't want to go there with them. Another thing that's important to recognize is realize that most people living with a chronic illness have pursued to great length something that will help their ailment, either bring a cure or improve their their quality of life. And it's likely members of their family have done the same thing. It's really pretty presumptuous for somebody to come along who knows very little about that person and assume they have the solution to their health problem. In fact, in some sense, it's insulting to the person that you're giving that advice. Like they haven't been paying attention to what's going on in their life, like they haven't sought the best medical advice they could get, etc. So if I could just make a very strong appeal, whatever you do, don't give unsolicited health advice. Second, don't talk like you know how they feel. In fact, I just heard somebody do this past week. A family lost their home due to a fire. And a person said to them, I know exactly how you feel because I lost a home in a fire too. Well, it's true that that person might have a little bit more empathy than somebody else because they walked through that. But frankly, you can't know how someone else feels. You can't know exactly how they feel. And all of us respond to and feel differently to similar experiences, right? So here's how I illustrate it. Obviously, what's on the right is an Egg McMuffin. And chronic illnesses are not like Egg McMuffins. If you get an Egg McMuffin in West Lafayette or Indianapolis or Chicago or San Francisco or Dallas or New York, they're going to be identical, right? They're going to be the same. Same ingredients, same amount of ingredients, cooked the exact same way, taste the same. Chronic illness isn't like that. Chronic illness manifests itself differently in different people, and different people experience it differently, even through the stages of chronic illness. Because we all have our own personalities. We all have our other outward experiences that are added to it. And so you can't equate one person's chronic illness with another. I have multiple sclerosis, but it manifests itself in me differently than other patients. I have friends who have multiple sclerosis and their experience is very different than mine. Just because you have the same disease doesn't mean someone's experience is going to be the same. I might respond to the vicissitudes of my disease different than someone else to theirs. This is something that I have to tell you, I hear from patients is really irritating when somebody tells them they know how they feel. In fact, here's a little card that expresses that. This one card says, when people without Crohn's, which is an inflammatory bowel disease, when people without Crohn's say to people with Crohn's, man, my stomach hurts, I know how you feel, all we can do is smile or punch them in the face. Well, I hope you won't go to the latter route, but you get the sentiment there. The person is saying something foolish, that your tummy ache equates to my disease, not quite. So recognize that it's simply not true that you can know how someone else feels just because you know what ailment they have. Unless they tell you, you can't know. And even more important, it's not helpful. It's not helpful to say that. You may attempt to say that as a way of expressing your empathy, but that's not the way it's going to come across. It's actually going to come across as self-centered. It's like, I don't need to hear from you. I know just what you're going through. I know what you're doing. It's not helpful. So avoid that. Don't talk like you know how someone else feels. Ask them. Let them communicate. Let them share. You can't understand how they feel unless they tell you. And don't play the comparison game. There's a little cartoon here. This guy says, I'm depressed. And the gal responds, oh yeah? Well, I have depression and anxiety. One-upmanship, right? It's amazing how people quickly play the comparison game. As some of you who attend Faith West know, I went a couple of years back through multiple surgeries, one on each elbow, and I spent about 2 months with my left arm in a sling, and then after that healed, about 2 months with my right arm in a sling. And so, of course, I spent a lot of time coming to church and other places with my arm in a sling over 4 months. It was amazing how often someone would come up to me with my arm was in a sling, and they'd say, hey, what happened? And I said, I had some surgery on my elbow. And almost without fail, the next thing that happened was the person told me about the time they broke their wrist, or the time they hurt their elbow, or the time they had their arm in a sling for whatever reason. It was amazing just how often it happened that people just immediately want to tell me about their experience and compare it. I don't know why there's this natural inclination in us that seems to want to bring the conversation immediately to our experience and away from what the person is experiencing at the moment, but it's not helpful to play the comparison game. I mean, first of all, it's going to come off as sounding self-focused. Instead of expressing care and concern about that person, you've now drawn the conversation to yourself and your experience. And sometimes people would share that with me, and it happened when they were like 10 or 12. Why you tell me now? And you know what? It's often going to be heard as trivializing their pain. When you play that comparison game, it's going to sound like you're trivializing their pain. In my first decade with back pain, it was so excruciating. There were so many days that it was all I could do to hold back tears as I went through work. Riding a car was just horrendously painful. But yet I can't tell you how many times I'd be standing in a meeting because I just didn't sit. Everybody else is sitting, and somebody with Sherlock Holmes insight would turn to me and say, "Oh, you have a bad back, huh?" I'd say, "Yeah," and they'd say something like, "Yeah, I get a kink in my back every now and then." You know, all that did was trivialize my pain. I mean, I'm on the verge of tears, and they're telling me that they get a pain every now and then in their back. I hadn't been pain-free for years. And so what their expression did really was, though they didn't intend to, it just trivialized my pain. And it's important to realize that when you do that, it actually doesn't communicate your empathy. It actually, in many ways, shows that you don't understand and you're not concerned what that person is going through right now. So avoid playing the comparison game. The fourth thing is don't assume what they can or cannot do because of their ailment. If you want an interesting experience, the next time you're flying somewhere and have to make a connecting flight and have a significant amount of time, and obviously planes are back in the air, but I presume most of you aren't traveling too much anymore recently. But if you have some time in between flights when you do that in the future, sit down in one of the vacant wheelchairs that's in there. You know, the wheelchairs are often hanging around, and see how people interact with you while you're sitting in a wheelchair. It's a very interesting experience. One thing, you'll find that people will talk really loud to you, as though whatever put you in the wheelchair has somehow impaired your hearing. I don't know what it is. People talk really loud when you're sitting in a wheelchair. Or the other thing they'll do is they'll talk to you like you're a child. They really, like, for somehow, whatever has placed you in a wheelchair has also caused cognitive decline. It's just amazing how people do that. It's so natural. I don't know why. It just is pretty consistent. Don't assume what someone's abilities are or they aren't. Where appropriate, ask. Ask if it would be helpful for you to do something. Ask whether, can you walk down here or should we go another way? Are the stairs okay for you, or would you rather take the elevator? Ask. And for those who live with illnesses, we have to be willing to accept help. We have to be willing to accept people making changes. It might be that we say, you know what, it really would be better to take the elevator. Or, you know what, I just really can't walk down that hill. Can we walk around this longer way? And we have to be willing to acknowledge that when someone shows the care by asking us if we can or cannot do that. It's also important to realize that people that live with pain, people that live with fatigue, sometimes they just have to push themselves. You want to, as a patient, try to live as much of a normal life as you can. And it is hard living with the limitations that you face. But there are times that you have to push yourself. And sometimes this is hard for family members. Sometimes a person that lives with pain will push themselves to do something, and they know it's going to create more pain. They know it's going to create a period of uncomfortableness. But they want to live life. And they make a choice and decide to do something they know will be painful because they believe that it's beneficial to them. And we need to give them freedom to do that. Now, if you're particularly close to the person and you feel like that's happening at times that's unnecessary, you might have a conversation with them, particularly a spouse might. But the reality is people who live with limitations because of physical ailments will need to try to push themselves. Otherwise, you can just surrender to your ailment. I want to give you a few things you can do. I've said some things that you shouldn't do, and I hope that doesn't motivate you to avoid people living with chronic illness. That's certainly not the intent, but rather to help you do it wisely. But let me talk about some things you can do. One thing to do is respond with empathy. Paul tells us in Romans chapter 12, verse 15, that we are to rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. You know, when somebody tells you what's happening to them physically, and it strikes your heart with sadness, it's okay to express that sadness. And in fact, you should. I mean, that's what empathy really is all about, right? It's being able to enter into someone else's experience. And if the experience is painful, we shouldn't brush it off. We should acknowledge it for what it is. We should acknowledge the reality that they are going through a tough time. And we can see it. We realize it. And we share in that sorrow with them. Empathy is simply the ability to understand and share in the feelings of another. And it's biblical. We are to rejoice with those who rejoice, and we are to weep with those who weep. And so the way to do that is to listen and to understand their pain. And this is particularly true if this is a friend that you encounter on a regular basis. The time and place has to be appropriate, but it is certainly appropriate to say, so how are things going living with your chronic back pain now? How are things going with your arthritis? What's it doing in your life? What challenges is it creating for you? And when you ask those kind of questions, what you show them is that you understand that this disease is impacting their life, and you care. You care enough to want to know. And communicate in a way that shows your empathy, that you do care. Don't brush it off. Don't be afraid of the conversations. You might say things like, wow, life sounds really challenging for you at the moment. Because it is, and just acknowledge it. But when you acknowledge it, when you verbalize that, what you're communicating to them is, you know what, they've been listening to me. Or, I can hear the frustration in your voice. Just because you can't remove that frustration doesn't mean you should ignore it. It's okay to acknowledge it, that they're frustrated about the things they can't do. They're frustrated at the loss that they have experienced. This is where Job's friends really failed. Instead of joining him in his lament and lamenting with him, they tried to tell him that his thoughts were all wrong. Another thing you could say is just acknowledge, I'm at a loss for words listening to you describe what you've been going through. It's okay to admit that you don't know what to say when you don't know what to say. And tell them that, because that in itself communicates that you understand the gravity of what they are going through. And of course, one of the great privileges that we have as followers of Jesus Christ is to intercede for one another in prayer. And it's a great encouragement to know that other people are praying for you. So one of the ways of being a very practical help is to tell people you'll pray for them, but only do so if you're going to follow through. Only tell them that you will pray for them if you really will. You might, if the time is appropriate, the setting appropriate, pause right then and there and pray for them. But promising to pray should only be made if you're going to keep that promise. And so you might just simply ask them, how can I best pray for you? And if you have someone that's in your life on a regular basis that lives with chronic illness, you could periodically ask them, how can I best pray for you? What's going on right now? Are there things, there are decisions, there's changes, anything coming up that I could particularly be praying for? I mean, obviously that's a good question to ask any fellow believer, right? What's going on in your life that I could pray for? How can I best pray for you? But particularly somebody who is living with chronic illness, you could ask them because things change. For all you know, they are facing a critical medical decision. And by your offering to pray, they may share that with you and ask you to join, and that should be a great privilege to be able to do that. And then another way is to ask and see if you can be of practical help to them. Is there something specific that you can do right now? But only ask if you're sincere. Only ask if you're going to follow through. I guess we've all probably had experiences of people who have promised to be of help in some way or to do something, and then they don't follow through. Often people just forget; they get busy. But if you're gonna offer to be of help to somebody, boy, make sure you're going to follow through on that and follow through as quickly as practical. And it might be something just as simple as you may know a friend who it's hard for them to get out. Going to the store is not an easy thing, and you're running off to the store, and you could just give them a call or send them a text, say, hey, I'm going to the store, going to Payless. Anything can get you on there? Whatever it might be, sometimes you can identify, you can see it's visual, something that could be of help that you could offer specifically to do it. Or you might not know, but you could just ask them, is there a way that I can be of help practically, something I can do to lighten your load? And that can be a great help sometimes for people. Well, in the next session, we're going to talk a little bit more about this issue, about how we can be of help to other people, and talk about some very practical ways in particular that you can pray for individuals. I want to expand on that topic about ways you can pray for people who are living with chronic illness. But I'd also like to focus on how you can pray for people who are caregivers, an often not thought of group of individuals who have special challenges of their own as well. Well, let me close our time in prayer. Father, I thank you for the goodness and grace that you have given us in Jesus. Thank you for the fact that you have brought us into a body of believers, that we don't live this Christian life alone. And Father, we have great opportunities and great responsibilities in the community of faith that you have brought us into. And I pray that we would fulfill those well. That, Lord, we would rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. That we would serve one another with gladness, esteeming others as more highly than ourselves, and giving of ourselves to one another, as our Savior gave the example, who came, he said, not to be served, but to serve. Make us more like him, that we might be the hands and feet of Jesus to a watching world. And it's in his precious name that I pray. Amen.